The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $50, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Elias Thorne did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked up at what he had bought, a great dead machine standing off by itself at the edge of the lot, a horse-drawn steam fire engine. A hulking Victorian pumper of brass and iron riding tall on four-spoked wheels, its big riveted boiler and its tall smokestack rising over the pump gear, the whole thing furred over with rust and old paint gone to scale. The brass green black under 40 years of weather, so far gone the crowd read it as nothing but a wagon-load of scrap iron. A thing the town had written off the day the old firehouse came down, that 100 bidders had walked past as too heavy to move and too far gone to ever run again, and that Elias had just paid $50 to own, dead boiler and rust and rotted hose and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel lot at the end of summer, at a town surplus and estate auction held in the grassy yard beside a shuttered county fairground on the edge of a small farm town. Elias was 74 years old, lean and a little stooped now, but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, wire spectacles pushed up his nose, and pale, patient eyes that took their time. His hands were broad and scarred and marked at the knuckles with a lifetime of burns and old iron, the hands of a man who had spent his life reaching into hot machinery to make dead things run. He had worked at trade his whole life, a steam mechanic and boilerman, the one the mills and the road crews and the old fire companies sent for when an engine had to build pressure and hold it true. Until the steam rigs went to the scrapper one by one, and the new machines ran on gasoline and a starter button, and the old men who could read a boiler by ear and set a valve by feel were quietly closed out. The man who laughed was Royce Danner, who ran the biggest scrap-and-salvage yard in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud mustard-yellow blazer he wore to be seen in. His face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a stub of a cigar in the other. $50, Roy said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $50 for a rusted-out dead steam wagon, boilerman, boilers seized, tubes are rotted through, the brass is green, the hose is powder, and the whole thing's been stone cold since before you and I were young men. Nobody's raised steam in one of these since the fire companies went to motor trucks, and nobody's going to. You can't run it, you can't move it without a team and a lowboy, and it's too far gone to fix. You didn't buy a fire engine, old-timer. You bought a ton of scrap brass and pig iron on 4 rotted wheels, and you paid $50 for the privilege of hauling it home when the wrecker would have run it to the dump for nothing. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry. The old man's dead steam wagon, and it stuck for the rest of that month. The crowd laughed because Royce laughed, the way a crowd does. Elias stood through it without a change in his face, his hands folded quiet in front of him, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something made to run and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Elias's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Elias said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Royce Danner could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Elias had stood in front of that dead engine with 50 years of the trade awake in him. The crowd saw a rusted heap on wheels. Elias saw the engine, under the scale the way the boiler was riveted and stayed, the careful cast of the pump body. The great fluted stack and the fittings drawn out by a hand that knew exactly how much iron a thing needed and no more. The work was wrong for what they were all saying. He knew what a plain factory engine looked like, stamped out by the dozen, and what a real builder's looked like, cast and fitted and finished by one careful shop. This was a builder's. Above all, he knew that a proud old engine builder almost always cast his name where the world would never think to look, on a plate under the boiler jacket, stamped on the frame beneath the pump, sealed dry in the cab where the driver rode. The rest of them were pricing the thing by the ton of brass. Elias knew the difference between scrap iron and a great engine somebody had let die, and what he found that night would cut a forgotten builder's name, and the first engine that builder ever made, back into the record that had let them both go. Elias had come up hard. He went to the boiler shop young, apprentice to an old engineman, learning the fire and the water and the long patient feel of steam until a boiler built its pressure even and true, and made himself into the kind of hand a mill or a fire company called by name when the machine had to hold. His wife Marion had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own. And after Marion was gone, he lived alone in a small house behind his old shop with his rows of spare fittings and his quiet. The town had a use for his hands and no use at all for his memory. He knew that. He bid on the engine anyway. He bid because he knew it. A man who had raised steam in 1,000 boilers could no more walk past a great engine going for scrap brass than walk past his own past. The crowd had seen a dead steam wagon. Elias had seen the machine as it was, cast and riveted and fitted by somebody who knew exactly what he was building and had signed his name where a proud builder signs it. If you've made it this far into Elias Thorne's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the surplus first, the old fair tables and iron benches and box tools knocked down to the dealers, while Elias waited at the edge of the lot beside the tall, dead engine. When the auctioneer finally came to the silent steam pumper and called for a bid, Royce glanced up at it, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Elias raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 50. He paid cash, signed the slip, and arranged to bring a team and a lowboy trailer around at the end of the day, because a horse-drawn steam engine was an awkward, heavy thing to move whole, and the rules gave a man until dark to haul off what he had bought. The story got around the town before Elias's trailer was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, whether he was going to raise steam on his dead wagon and put out a fire to get his $50 back. Ed Marsh, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer, that there was nothing to a dead fire engine but rust and rot and a wrecking crew glad to see the back of it. Elias was buying a can of penetrating oil, a soft wire brush, and a box of clean rag, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that an engine is either a builder's or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Elias did not open the engine up in the daylight. With the dealer's truck still on the lot and Royce holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out, and he had the great machine home, backed down off the lowboy, and stood square on the floor of his shop under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night, after the town had gone quiet and the windows up the street had gone dark. He did not tear into it. He knew that an engine keeps its truth deep under the iron, behind the boiler jacket, down under the pump, sealed dry in the driver's cab, and that you reach those places slowly, the way you reach into anything a careful hand once closed up. He wire-brushed the worst of the scale off the boiler and read the rivet work as it came clean. And when the first patch of good iron came up under his lamp, he stopped with the rag in his hand, because what came up was not stamped-out factory plate, but iron cast and drawn and fitted by somebody who cared how it held as well as whether it ran, and it stood there under his hand like something that had been waiting for exactly this. Down at the diner they were still asking if he had put out any fires yet. Elias moved the lamp in past the pump gear back toward the boiler jacket, the way you go looking for the place a builder hides his name. The engine had its own long, hard history, and the town had let it go for scrap with never once asking after it. It ran back to the man who built it, a self-taught 19th-century American engine builder of no fame in his own time, who had learned the founder's trade alone in a river town, works, and set out to build steam fire engines in an age when the famous makers already had the city sewn up. And it ran back to the first engine that builder ever made. This one, the first of its line. The machine a man stakes his whole shop on, a full steam fire pumper he cast and riveted and fitted far beyond what a poor county could pay, because he wanted, once at the start, to build the finest engine he was capable of and set it where it would run. It answered every alarm in that county for a generation, and then the town went to motor trucks, and the old firehouse closed and was forgotten. And the engine sat cold in the dark behind a boarded door until the tubes rotted and the paint scaled, and no one alive remembered that the first engine of a whole line had ever been raised in that little works. The builder himself died poor and unknown, his name on no famous engine, his first and finest work sealed up in a dying firehouse where no collector ever thought to look. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of a man who builds the finest thing he has in him and sets it in a place the world forgets. The answer had been standing at the edge of the lot the whole time, silent under the rust in a $50 engine nobody wanted. Elias brushed the scale from the last of the boiler jacket and reached in under it to the great riveted shell. And what he found under the lamp told him whose engine it was before he had it half clean. Bolted to the shell under the jacket, filmed over with 40 years of rust and grease, was a small cast plate, not stamped tin, not a painted number, but cast brass. The letters raised proud in the metal, the way a builder marks a thing he means to stand behind. A maker's plate. The builder's own name and his Rivertown cast into it, and below the name a serial line that read, plain as day, No. 1. Elias wiped it clean with his thumb and the rag, breathing shallow, and when the name stood clear in the lamplight, he set the rag down and stood very still. He knew the name. Any man who had come up in the steam trade knew that name. A builder spoken of quietly among steam men as one of the great lost hands, self-taught and never famous, whose few surviving engines were half legend, and whose very first engine, the one that started the line, had never been found. So scarce a whole working life could pass without a man ever laying hands on his work at all. And here it stood, cast in the builder's own brass, No, one under his name, bolted to the shell of an engine that could only be the lost first one. But the plate was only the start of it. Elias went deeper now, drawing back the seized cover of the pump body and reading the frame beneath it, and there, stamped into the cast iron by the builder's own dies a lifetime ago and never meant for any eye but a mechanic's, was the name again, and a date, and the serial once more. No, one. And in the driver's cab, in a dry iron box built under the seat, where a careful man will keep the thing he most wants saved, sealed against the weather in waxed cloth, Elias found a small, leather-bound book, the builder's logbook, the record of the engine, in his own hand, every stay and tube and casting of it, and folded inside, the story of the first engine he ever staked his shop on. Elias sat down on his shop stool with the book open under the lamp and read it slowly, and understood that the dead steam wagon the town had laughed at for a month was the lost first engine of a great forgotten builder, the founding engine of his whole line, the one everybody in the trade had given up as gone, worth a small fortune to a museum that knew that name, and worth far more than money as the recovered first work of a man the world had let disappear. The next morning Elias did not call a scrapyard, and did not strip the engine for its brass and its iron, and did not gut the frame into one of those rustic reclaimed fire-engine garden fountains, or a bar cart for his own porch, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $50 for a dead steam wagon. And he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the maker's plate and the logbook first to a museum of American industry that knew what the name meant, and set himself to the harder thing, to cut a forgotten builder's name and the first engine of his life back into the record that had dropped them, and to find what descendants that builder had left, and put into their hands the fact that their people had built something great, not nothing at all. The curator went very still over the plate and the logbook, and said quietly that a whole recoverable engine by that builder, the founding No One itself, its own logbook with it, was the kind of thing a museum waits a lifetime for, and had all but given up as gone, and that the man who built it had been no failed country boilerman at all, but exactly the kind of overlooked master the record is supposed to keep, and had simply lost. And the builder had descendants in the country still, a great-grandson 2 counties over among them, a gray man who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old great-grandfather had built fire engines and died with nothing, a story the family told as a failure and mostly let go. Elias went to him that fall with a photograph of the cleaned engine, the builder's cast plate plain on the shell, and the logbook open to the man's own hand, and watched a gray man read his own great-grandfather's name cast into the first engine of his life, No One beneath it, beside the curator's word that the man had built one of the great lost American engines and been forgotten for it. He put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up thinking their old builder a man who failed at a poor trade. The logbook told them instead that he had built the finest engine he had in him and set it to work for people who could barely pay, and that the world had simply chosen to forget the engine instead of remember it. The man asked why he had troubled to come so far to give a poor dead ancestor back his good name. Elias said only that a builder casts his name where nobody will ever look, and seals his logbook under the driver's seat, because he needs to believe that someday somebody will come who can find it, so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having built the thing at all. and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to. So he had brought the old builder's name and the old builder's first engine home to the people they were always meant for. There was one thing more Elias did before the engine left his shop, and he did it for the builder and for no one else. He restored it the slow, careful way over a season of nights, freed the seized pump and restayed the boiler, cleaned and retubed where the iron would take it, freed the fittings and brought the brass back, and stood the whole rig square on its spoked wheels the way it had left the works, not to make a show of it, but because an engine a great builder had poured his life into deserved to do the one thing it was made to do. And he did not strip it for its brass, and did not gut the frame into a fountain or a lawn piece, because using a lost first of its line engine for scrap or a novelty was the most ordinary thing in the world, the very thing that had nearly killed it, and there was no truth in it. The truth was the engine itself, the name cast into its shell, and the pressure the builder had built it to hold. So on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Elias laid a small fire in the box, worked the pump by hand to prime it, and brought the old boiler up slow and careful until the needle lifted off its pin and the engine stood there breathing steam under the work lamp, the first pressure that machine had held in 40 years. Low and even and true, the whole rig ticking and warm to the rafters. He had not scrapped it or made a fountain of it. That part was never the point. He had made it live again so that the man who built it would be seen one time by somebody who finally understood what he was. That fall, the engine went where it belonged, into a museum of American industry with the builder's name read clear at last and his lost first engine name beside it in the record. And the pride of it, and a share of what a recovered engine like it is worth, went to the builder's descendants the logbook helped Elias find, generations late. So the family that had thought their old man a failure knew at last that he had built one of the great lost American engines. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Elias a fool let the name, the old man's dead steam wagon, drop, and did not pick it up again. Royce Danner was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look inside, and the next time he held court by the auction table the others did not lean in so far. Being right was the whole of what Elias had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten builder's name and the first engine of his life back up out of 40 years of rust. The museum kept the engine where the town could see it. They set the tall steam pumper in the middle of the front hall under a soft light, the brass polished and the boiler warm black again, the pump freed and the fittings bright. The maker's cast plate read clear on the shell and the builder's own logbook open in a case beside it. The lost first engine of a great forgotten builder, restored to his own name at last, and once a month they raised a little steam in it and let the old pump breathe, and a card told whoever came through that this engine had been the first work of a self-taught American builder the world let disappear, torn out of a dying firehouse and hauled toward the dump, and running again only because one man troubled to open the thing they laughed at. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Elias Thorne drove over to look in on it, and there in the last of the sun stood the engine, whole and freed and seen at last, the brass glowing warm where a stranger's hands had finally reached it. Elias was 74 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad-scarred hand flat on the cool iron of the shell beside the cast name and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A builder casts his name where nobody will ever look and seals his logbook under the driver's seat and trusts that somebody will come who can find what his hands made under whatever the years lay over it, so that being forgotten for a lifetime can never be the same as never having built the thing at all, and a town rarely knows what greatness was left to rust at its own fence line until somebody troubles to open the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Elias Thorne right to give the engine to a museum under the builder's name and put the worth of it into the family's hands without keeping it for himself? Or was that one decency too far, in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.